seconds. Audio. Okay, now Connie, if you could say exactly what we're doing here today.
Today we're interviewing Dr. Raphael Cassimere. He's a professor at the University of New Orleans. This is part of the Contemporary New Orleans and Oral History project concerning the mayoralty of Ernest Dutch Morial.
Very good. And if you could just say and spell your name.
My name is Connie Atkinson, Atkinson.
Good. Dr. Cassimere, if you could do the same.
Raphael Cassimere Jr., Raphael Cassimere.
Good. And is Eric
Yes.
part of this too?
Yes.
Just hand him the mic and let him do that too. Just, yeah, you can speak into it.
Okay. My name's Eric Hardy. I'm a graduate research assistant with the Dutch Morial Research Project.
Spell your name.
ERICHARDY.
Great.
Thank you, Eric.
Okay, whenever you're ready.
Dr. Cassimere, thank you for participating in the Morial Oral History Project. I'm going to ask some questions about the period, and then my associate Eric Hardy will have some specific issues that he'd like you to speak on.
Okay.
Today is a conversation about the period of Dutch Morial's first mayoralty and right before then. We're interviewing you today because of your close ties, one of the reasons your close ties to the NAACP and other civil rights groups and initiatives before and during the Dutch Morial era in New Orleans. Can you take us back to that place? Can you give us a picture of the strategies that Black New Orleanians used to get access to government in the civil rights era, the pre-civil rights era, mainly the era of the 60s, and then how that changes with the Morial campaign?
Well, first of all, we're trying to get blacks registered to vote. And I participated in my first voter registration campaign in 1960. One of the things I learned that it was a very slow process, that the registrars had a lot of discretion as to who would be passed. And then in 1961, they made it even more difficult when they added what they called the citizenship test. A lot of questions that a lot of people wouldn't know, particularly blacks who had not received a much formal education. I remember one of the questions was, what is the size in square miles of the District of Columbia? And I knew that because it's in the Constitution. Not many other people knew that. Who was the second president of the United States? And it was really kind of a trick question because all blacks knew George Washington was the first president. And they knew at least one other president other than the current president. And invariably they would say Abraham Lincoln. And that was wrong, of course. And so it became almost impossible to pass the voter registration test. But then once the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed, then it became easier. And the strategy then was to get enough blacks get enough blacks registered so that you could have an impact upon the white candidates who were running. And it really made an impact in 1965 in a race between Vieux Carre and I guess it was Fitzmaurice who ran the first time. It had an impact in 1967 when Dutch Morial ran for the House seat. Mm-hmm. He became the first black legislator in the 20th century. We played a part in that in voter registration and also in getting out to vote. And by 1969, Dutch Morial thought that there was a chance that some black could run for a citywide office, perhaps a school board or the city council. And he ran for a seat on the council at large, came in very close second, but he lost. And then after that, he kind of laid back, and he got appointed judge of the juvenile court, and then he got to become an appeals court judge. But I remember a conversation he had with me about 19 about 1975, I remember it was at the old Warwick Hotel. I don't know who the other person was, but there were 4 of us. And he asked me, would I support him if he ran for mayor in 1977? And before I answered, I asked him, do you think he can win? And his answer was, if he ran, it was because he thought he could win. Now, he really was ahead of most people, because most blacks, including most black leaders, did not think that a black could be elected mayor at that particular time. And of course, he just kind of sneaked up on the rest of them, and he qualified. A lot of blacks didn't think he had a chance to win and did not even vote for him. But because he came in first, in the first primary, then of course all of those dollars, most of them came over and they voted for him in the runoff. And November 12th, 1977, Dutch Morial is mayor-elect of New Orleans.
Back when you first started getting involved at a very young age with the NAACP, can you tell us a little bit about your role? Did you get involved in activities such as the boycotts before you were a member of the NAACP, involved in the youth in the NAACP, or after? How did that work? You personally?
I had gotten involved right here as a student at UNO because the cafeteria, which was run by Morrison, did not admit blacks. They did, in fact, operate a stand-up snack bar in another building. And we accepted that. I came here the second year.
What year was that?
In September of 1959. And that first semester we accepted, and I guess because we were used to it. I mean, everything practically was segregated by race at that particular time. And it bothered us because at different times we'd go into the cafeteria and try to get served. Of course, we were not served. But then when the sit-ins began in the spring of 1960, particularly the sit-ins that were conducted by Southern students in Baton Rouge, we looked at it a little bit differently. And just 2 of us, just talking, Linda Grange and I, decided, hey, we ought to do something. And just by word of mouth, we organized a boycott of the snack bar, which was very, very successful. And we went to Hitt, who was vice president at that particular time. He was not yet chancellor. We went to A.P. Tureaud, who was the attorney who had filed the lawsuit to desegregate LSUNO. He wasn't really that concerned. He kind of surprised us. He thought we were here to get a good education and should not be that concerned about it. But we asked him to go back into court, and he did. And it put pressure on the university. And as a result of that, Morrison gave up his lease, and the university began to operate a non-segregated cafeteria beginning in the spring of 1961. But in the meantime, I had joined the NAACP in July of 1960. Excuse me. The national NAACP was reorganizing youth councils. There had been one in New Orleans, but it had become defunct. And a friend of mine invited me to the meeting, and I promised to go without really planning to go. But by chance, we were studying at the public library, one of the few places where blacks and whites could meet on an integrated basis. And he brought me to the meeting, which was in the law office of Tureaud, Morial, and Trudeau. And that's the first time I met Dutch Morial. I knew about him because his brother was the assistant principal at my high school, and my first thought was, wow, there's Mr. Morial with hair on his head. Walter Morial was bald, and Dutch had a full head of hair. And we hit it off right away. And I got so inspired, I had not even joined. I got elected vice president. I joined the next week, which was illegal. And I got involved in writing memberships. And then almost around the same time, CORE came to New Orleans. And a lot of us had kind of overlapping memberships in CORE and the NAACP. And we had joint meetings, and we decided that we were going to have a sit-in in New Orleans. CORE would do the sit-in and we expected that they were going to be arrested, and we would do the picketing. And I think it was out the 17th of September, something like that, 1960. They were arrested, we picketed, we continued picketing for almost a year and nothing happened. But that was my first involvement. But I also got involved in the voter registration drive in the fall of 1960. And we found a lot of old people really wanted to register. We conducted classes for them, tried to show them how to fill out the forms, and it was really kind of fun.
Now, you were picketing for what specifically at that time?
We were picketing basically to desegregate the lunch counters, that's all.
Okay.
But then that changed in the spring of 1963, when we started picketing for hiring of blacks above the median level. And of course that
At
changed the
UNO.
dynamics. No, that was at downtown stores on Canal
Downtown.
Street. At that time, Canal was a hub for all Metro New Orleans. I mean, Lakeside, I think, had just opened maybe a year too early, but most people who lived in Jefferson and New Orleans and Seminole parishes came to Canal Street to shop. And so we started picketing to get them to hire black cashiers and salespeople.
Can I ask you, 1963, and when was the first picketing of Dryad Street? How did that work, and did you get involved in that?
That was in late '59 and '60. I think I picketed once or twice.
And what was that for?
Well, that was under the aegis of the Consumers League.
Okay.
Most of the customers of the Dryad Street stores were black. So they were kind of easy talkers. And they gave in, most of them, within, I'd say, 2 months. And I was not a part of any organization at that particular time, but they were recruiting college students at picket. And it was fun because we met people from Dillard and from Xavier, and it kind of whet our appetites. And a lot of those people who had picketed on Dryad Street, and they subsequently got involved with the NAACP Youth Council with CORE.
Now, specifically, what did they want on Dryad Street?
Jobs.
Jobs.
That's the first place where you had black sales clerks and cashiers and the like. Dryad Street.
Was the black shopping district the predominant
For
black
those who
shopping
lived
district?
uptown. I mean, I had
Right.
never gone to the Dryad Street Shopping Center because I lived way down in the
Yeah.
Ninth Ward. But for blacks who lived uptown, it was one of the places where you could get, I guess you'd call, modestly priced clothes.
So in 1961 or 2, could black shoppers shop on Canal Street?
Oh, yeah.
But there were
You
no
could shop, and I think it only been in the late 40s when you could try on clothes. I think maybe like 47. Before that time, if you were black and you wanted to buy an evening gown or you wanted to buy a hat, you couldn't try it on. You had to guess about the size. You bought it, you couldn't exchange it.
So by 1963, the issue was black jobs on Canal Street,
Right.
and you participated in that.
Right. We had already been picketing, I think, Crest, McCroris, and Woolworth. But then the black ministers and some of the other black leaders had begun to put pressure on the Canal Street stores to start hiring above the menial level. And without us being a part of the negotiating, we didn't know that they had made a deal that for not boycotting Easter in 1963, they were going to hire collectively among all of the stores 150 blacks above the menial level. And they were going to do that within 90 days.
Who negotiated that deal?
There was this strange biracial committee, and it was strange because there were a group of black leaders and there were a group of white leaders, and they never met, except there were intermediaries who negotiated between the two. Harry Kelleher and Harry McCall were the white representatives, and Lolis Eli and Revis Artique were the black representatives. Now, I was president of the NAACP Youth Council, but we didn't have any representation on the committee. Dutch Morial, as president of the adult branch, did have representation. And it was Dutch who brought us a listing that had been provided to the black leaders of where blacks had been hired. And he asked us to check them out. Now, they had said they would come up with 75 jobs first. And Llewellyn Soniac, who was the advisor to the Youth Council at the time, we went checking. And I think we found maybe like 24 of the 75 that they say they'd had. And I remember they had listed that there was a black salesman at D.H. Holmes. And we went there and asked, where's the black salesman? And the guy said, black salesman? We don't have any black salesmen. We don't need any black salesmen. I said, okay, maybe later you will. Now, again, they listed about 70 jobs. We only found 24. And then Father Eugene McManus, who was very actively involved, he used to teach at St. Hall, he told us that actually it had been an agreement for 150 jobs, not 75. And so, of course, we concluded that they are way off the course. And so we decided, without consulting with the black leaders, that we're going to give them a target date. If they didn't have 150 blacks by July 25th of '63, we were going to start picketing. And we did.
Without the support of the parent organization, either one?
Well,
Did
we
Morial say anything to you?
Well, Morial was there. Morial played a very interesting role. I mean, he was part of the committee. And when we went out with CORE, supposedly, even though they didn't supply any bodies, but they did agree. Well, they did have a few bodies the first day. CORE and the Consumers League. The Consumers League might have had 2. The Youth Council may have had 25 or 30. I think CORE might have had 5 or 6 people involved. But about 6 o'clock the first day, I don't know if it was Raphael Haley herself, but she was the chairman of the local CORE. Either Raphael Haley or somebody came down and said that the New York offices had told us to take the signs down.
New York offices of the NAACP, or the
Of
New
CORE,
York
I
of CORE.
suspect. And we started taking the signs down, and then Morial comes up, and I remember because he had a little Volkswagen. Don't take the signs down. He was suspicious of that request. He was going to send a night letter, and that was the first time I ever heard that. He was going to send a night letter to New York to find out if, in fact, they had ordered the signs down. So we stayed, and we stayed by ourselves. Now, eventually, Morial got unhappy because he was being pressured by the other members of the committee that he had no control of us, and really he didn't, because the youth councils were autonomous from the senior branches. We were equal, theoretically. I mean, and probably in many ways because we raised our own money. So by, I'd say, October of that same year, 1963, we had lost a lot of support. When we got out there in July, we had lots of pickets. We had lots of support because we thought we were going to be there for 2 or 3 weeks. Kellerhall and McCall did call us in. And we thought they would call us in to negotiate. They called us in to tell us that we shouldn't be picketing because it was interfering with their efforts to negotiate with the other merchants. And it may have been. But we let them know that this is an NAACP Youth Council operation now, and they were going to have to negotiate with us. They did not. So the strategy after that time, we were going to have to negotiate individually with different stores. And I think the first time we tried that was maybe in October or November. We started going to individual stores. And we started breaking the small stores first. It really didn't have any impact on the big stores. But I remember either George Washington's birthday in '64 or around that time, we got Woolworth to capitulate. I used to work at night. And I remember I was sleeping, I was going to come out later, and Kalamba, who was he was either the treasurer or vice president, but in any case, he called me because he and Mr. Soniak had gone to negotiate with Woolworth. They had 2 stores, one in the 7 and one in the 1000 block of Canal Street.
Right.
And just looking at it, they found out that there were a lot of blacks who were working there, more than the goal that we had established for them. And so he called me, and I said, well, what do you think? He said, I think we ought to suspend picketing because it looks like they have done a good job. Well, Mr. Soniak was opposed to it. I mean, the rule that we had made was that the signs could only be removed by a vote of the Youth Council. And we used to meet every Tuesday night, so this was a Saturday. When I got down there, I said, okay, we're not going to picket Woolworth. I just made that decision. We're not going to picket Woolworth. And it had an impact because we used to picket the whole block. And here we picketed and we stopped at Woolworth. And people began to see it. And I remember he had been opposed to it, but then he went to work at the post office and he called me about 8 o'clock. Man, they're talking about it. Well, that was a brilliant decision that you made because they want to know why we're not picketing Woolworth. And once the people began to realize that there was some progress being made, and then some of them decided again they would stay out.
I have a question about, we wanted to talk about the involvement of Lou Soniak just for a moment. In the Canal Street demonstrations, there wasn't a command central then, whether Soniak and Dutch Morial, did they, what was their participation in these decisions? You've said a little about that.
Well, Morial had been, along with Soniak, our youth advisor until he became president. He became president in 1963.
Morial did.
And then Soniak became the advisor by himself, and of course he took the position of the youth. We did have a command place, St. James AME Church on Romans. It was about maybe 8 blocks from Canal and Rent Park. So that's where we kept our signs, and that's where we kind of shape up.
Right.
And that's where we go back at the end of the day. Soniak was the one person throughout the whole campaign who, at least publicly, always insisted that we were winning. I mean, there were times when I doubted it, that we were winning, but he kept insisting that we were winning. And
so who was he? What was his significance, do you think? He's not mentioned. He's kind of a shadow figure in this story.
His significance is that he really was the glue. In fact,
what?
he
I'm
served
sorry?
the glue of the Youth Council. He served as advisor for 30 years. So presidents came and went. Now, we had an unusual Youth Council. really unusual because we really ran our own organization. In most youth councils, the advisors, almost like directors, they signed checks. Some of them presided over meetings. We didn't do that. And probably the reason was because when we first got organized, all of the officers were college students. I mean, youth councils they used to run until age 24. Now there's an intermediate group called the Young Adult Council, so you get out at age 21. So we were older than many youth councils. Even I think I was 18 when I first became president. But Soniac was cheerleader, and he was a great example because he used to work in the post office at night. So he'd get off, I think about 1 o'clock in the morning. It took him about an hour to get uptown in Carrollton. He would get there somehow or another. Sometimes, I know he used to call the post office and ask if he could come 15 minutes late or half an hour late because he wanted to stay there a little bit longer. So he is really the example of the person who was just tireless.
Right.
And again, he was an adult.
Okay. What was your goal, do you think? Because as your organization, we're going to talk about some other organizations. What was your goal when you're doing this? What did you see as your particular youth council, NAACP? If you won, what would it be? What was your image of this vision of the city?
You mean the way I saw it then or the way I see it now?
Both.
It was a moving target. It was evolving. I mean, we talked about freedom and first-class rights and equality as if they were interchangeable. What we were looking for at least was a removal of all of the visible signs of segregation. There still were a lot of signs where whites only. One of the things we were really concerned about when you went to Sears, they only had one water fountain. It was for whites. There were a lot of places that had a colored water fountain. There were places, for example, that had restrooms for white men, for white women, and one for colored, bisex. Some didn't have any facilities at all for blacks. So we at least wanted to change that. And we wanted blacks to have what we thought were better jobs. And we look at it and I kind of laugh at it, sales clerks. And many stores, the best job a black could get, particularly if she was a fair complexion, was elevator operator. But blacks could cook, they could take out the garbage, but they couldn't sell. We used to say, as an example, Dr. Albert Dent, the president of Dillard University, couldn't sell socks. He wasn't qualified to have any of those kind of jobs because he was black. But later on, one of the things that we wanted was to be recognized the same as anybody else. So any legal forms of discrimination we wanted to overcome. And I often mention that the one that surprised me the most when it came was the desegregation of Charity Hospital. I was born in Charity Hospital, but in the colored side. And the ease with which Tureaud Hospital was desegregated really surprised me. I don't know why I thought that would have been hard enough to crack. I remember when Arthur Sopertall, who had been president in the 50s, but at this particular time was executive secretary for the adult branch, we went to talk to the director about desegregated hospital. And I said, we're all ahead of you. Because what we were going to say was that if you don't, we're going to file a complaint with HEW. Well, of course, they knew better than we did. They were getting about $30 million from HEW. They weren't going to lose that. And it was very interesting the way they desegregated. There used to be a colored side and there was a white side. And they would label all of the equipment, the linen, CW. So wheelchairs were labeled CW. They weren't going to throw away that. So they came up with a west, a central, and an east. They never had that before. So they still use the C and a W. And it just kind of blew my mind that it took place so easily.
Well, in all this, your vision of what the city would be, when did you begin, do you think, to envision that the city would be governed by a black mayor or a black city council? When did that possibility hit?
Probably late 60s. I remember I was invited to speak at Newman. Must have been about 67 or 68. And I don't know, for whatever reason, I kind of made this little flippant comment that you had better be nice to me because I may be the first black mayor of New Orleans. And I think that's the first time I even thought about it. Not that I was going to be black mayor, but before then, I think you kind of see things in degrees. You got to get blacks in the city council. I don't think we had got blacks in the legislature yet. Dutch didn't go to the legislature until 1968. So at that particular time, I think he had just gotten elected.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember he was elected at the same time Eddie Saper. And Eddie Saper was a graduate of Newman. And I don't even think Dutch had taken his seat yet in the legislature. So that's the kind of things that we're looking at. But I don't think any of us seriously thought about when we'd have the first black mayor.
Do you think Dutch thought of it before
He may
the
have.
rest of you?
He may have, because he has this whole list of firsts, and I'm sure it's not something that he just thought of overnight.
Yeah.
That was part of his calculation of how he was going to achieve this first. Which is very interesting, because there are a lot of people who, of course, who didn't know Dutch very well, who thought they knew him, and insisted that he wanted to be white. And I said, how do you want to be white? And he's very conscious of the fact that he's the first black to do all of these things.
So did he come out of nowhere?
I mean, he seemingly came out of nowhere, but he was always a little bit ahead of the curve. And as a result, then he kind of forced people to react to him. And again, by being first, and this is one thing that he understood, by being first, he was the first not just for himself, but for people who he represented. And he understood that pretty well.
He was very understanding of that. My colleague, Eric Hardy, had a few things he would like to
Your
talk
colleague
about.
and my student.
And your
Eric Hardy.
student, yes.
Okay, I wanted to ask you some things about the the mid-'60s, early '60s, mid-'60s. Could you speak of any of the, or were there any philosophical differences between African American organizations prior to this 1965 Voting Rights Act and after?
I think the philosophical differences were there, but they probably were much more of a strategy as opposed to goal. CORE and SNCC were probably a little bit more committed to nonviolent direct action than the NAACP was. The NAACP, of course, had been the trailblazer in the courts, and had it not been for those earlier court victories, then you would not have been able to take part in direct actions. Most of the members of CORE and SNCC were younger than the members of the adult chapters. I'm not talking about the youth councils. To a large extent, at least CORE was more integrated than the NAACP was. When you did, in fact, have a few whites who were part of the adult chapters, and we had some young whites who participated with us. But I think they were a little bit more idealistic and were much more committed to passive resistance, nonviolent. And in fact, they had workshops where they went to. We talked about nonviolence, but we defined it a little bit differently. We did believe that we had a right to defend ourselves, and so we gave you the first hit, but we were coming back. So it wasn't quite the same as CORE and SNCC. So maybe the strategy was a little bit different. Mm-hmm. I'm not so philosophically we were that much that far apart.
And what are those organizations such as BOLD, COO?
Those are after 65. Those are political organizations. Those are not civil rights organizations.
So would you see any differences between the institution?
The political organizations,
mm-hmm.
they're there for political gain. I'm not criticizing, but they were not civil rights organizations. We weren't interested in civil rights. And in fact, the NAACP has historically been nonpartisan, very politically, but we don't get involved in partisan politics. And the irony of it, of course, is it meant that in many cases we were opening doors that we didn't go through ourselves. The NAACP at first tried to prohibit NAACP officials from running from office, and if they did, they had to immediately resign. I remember when Dutch Morial, for example, was appointed U.S. Attorney, Assistant United States Attorney in 1965. He came before the executive committee and he asked for an indefinite leave of absence. And the answer was no. I mean, take the job. This is a very important first. You're not going to have any conflict of interest. Step down. So he stepped down. He had just started his second term as president. Rory Wilkins, for example, had set up a rule, and he would be later challenged by that if you were the president of an NAACP unit and you were appointed to or elected to a political office, you had to resign. And in fact, the board established that as a policy. But in one of the few cases where I know the national board has been overturned by the local units, they established a new policy, which is still in effect, that if you are elected, then you have to go back to your constituents, and they will determine whether or not you will stay or go. But Mr. Wilkins was just so committed to this position that we should not get involved in partisan politics that he tried to establish that as a rule. But the convention, the different units across the country decided that we're going to have something a little bit different.
So, would you characterize the NAACP as a sort of quasi-political training ground in any way, even though it was non-partisan?
Again, we got tremendous training in the NAACP. I mean, we knew how to conduct meetings. A lot of people did not. And I remember Dutch Morial calling me in to rake me over the coal for something I had done as chairman of the Vieux Carre Commission. This was much later. And I said, you put me on there with all of these uptown people who don't know anything about running meetings. Of course, he started fussing with me, and he started talking with these uptown. Well, they don't have the background that we had. They don't have the training that we had in the NAACP. We'd have workshops where we were trained in parliamentary procedure and in leadership, and it's true. Mm-hmm. Most of the first generation of black leaders, of black mayors and representatives came directly out of the NAACP. I remember the director of the NAACP branches, he would call the roll. I mean, he'd list somebody like Carl Stokes and Ken Gibson, I forgot the guy who was the first mayor of Garrett, Indiana. All of these were NAACP officials. Tom Bradley, Julian Bond, they all had come out of the NAACP.
Well, what segment of the New Orleans population do you think they were actually drawing their support from, or drawing members? The NAACP, or even CORE at this time?
New Orleans was always an NAACP community, and it's interesting because even when CORE did something, in the people's mind, it was the NAACP. Nobody could break in. The NAACP had been here since 1915, mm-hmm. and the civil rights movement had been identified with the NAACP.
So do you think that that sort of had a certain significance, at least to the white community, when dealing with the black community? Who were they going to go to when they needed support?
Yeah, I think so.
So would it...
I think, again, we had established that kind of legitimacy.
Mm-hmm.
I remember an incident, kind of humorously incident. I used to work at a bakery, an old German bakery, and I was very actively involved in civil rights, and nobody ever told me anything about being involved. And there was a little young white girl who came there, and they hired her as a cashier. She was a member of CORE. Now, the bakery was such that if you worked in the back where the boss and his wife worked, they were white, of course, most of the employees worked in the back where you actually did the baking. They used to have a restroom, and that's where everybody in the back went. They used to have another restaurant where the people in the front went. Well, the little girl from CORE had it wrong, and the owner, who was an old lady, her husband had built a business. The owner told the little girl, you go to this restaurant, and of course it's in the front, and her thought was that, well, that must be the restaurant for whites. And so I have to go to a restaurant where the blacks go because I'm a member of CORE. So, no, you go to this restaurant. No, I have to go to the back restaurant because I'm a member of CORE. And they went on, and then she finally said, well, put your ass anywhere you wanted to put it. And then she asked her daughter, who in the hell is a CORE anyway? Because she had no idea what she was talking about. She was just telling her because anybody, and they were black cashiers. They had black cashiers at this bakery in the 50s. I mean, it's really unusual. They were really good people to work for. But the old lady, of course, had no idea. All she wanted to do was read the paper and find out who died and how much money they left because she wanted people to know how much money that she had left when she died. But she didn't know who CORE was.
Folks is folks. You mentioned something about the NAACP getting recognition for some of CORE's activities. Mm-hmm. Did that create any rivalries?
There was always a little bit of rivalry. I mean, they were rivalries with NAACP units. It was friendly rivalry. But CORE was much more active outside of New Orleans after 1962. CORE was most active when Rudy Lombard was president. Rudy graduated from Xavier in 61. He went to graduate school at Syracuse. And I think Jerome had the chairmanship briefly, but then Jerome got involved in Mississippi and Alabama. Then Aretha Haley got it, and it's Aretha who really kind of pushed most of the whites out. she would lay down this rule that there would be no interracial dating. And there was some other problems. But there was rivalry, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Friendly rivalry.
Now, thinking back now on that period, would you say that there is a particular event that led to a greater sense of optimism or even disillusionment?
Wait. You can't have both of them. Particular event that led
Choose.
to a sense of optimism. The signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made illegal segregation in public places. And I remember Sonia and I were picketing on Canal Street, and I think we were the only two there. My wife, who wasn't my wife at that time, she may have come. She used to work, and she may have joined us. But I do remember when the president signed it, and they had announced that the president was going to sign it at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. When the president signed it, we went to Meal a Minute. Do you remember Meal a Minute? It used to be really good. And we went in because before that time, they didn't serve blacks. But they had kind of passed the word that, you're going to have to serve people. And I think I felt really good, particularly because I saw one of my high school teachers who I never thought really liked me. But she comments that you did this. And that really kind of made me feel good.
So was there any particular event? Now the second part of the question. Was
In
there
the low periods?
Yeah.
When King got assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
I know it really affected me. In fact, I remember when I first heard that he had died, and we had some kind of function that had been planned out here. And we had just organized an NAACP chapter on campus. And I didn't think it affected me. I mean, I knew it did, but I didn't think it affected me until I tried to back out of my garage with the gate closed, knock down the fence. And I did come out here. I don't know why. I thought people out here may not have known, but of course they did know about it, and they had closed the campus because they were afraid that something might happen. But I remember the next day I had to go up to Grand Rapids, Michigan for an NAACP regional conference. And on a plane from New Orleans to Chicago, it was almost a funeral atmosphere. There were only 3 blacks on the plane, but everybody seemed to have been affected by it. But then when I got to Chicago, it changed. I mean, you remember King, when he had gone to Chicago for his open housing campaign, he said he had never seen in the South the kind of hatred and the anger that he saw among whites in the North. And I remember on the plane from Chicago to Grand Rapids, there were people who were laughing. I hadn't read the paper yet, so I hadn't heard about him making his mountaintop speech and so forth. He had a dream now. I bet he's in hell having a nightmare. And I really felt bad about that. And of course, I didn't really want to go when I had called that early that morning and said, yeah, come on up, we're going to have the conference. I thought it was going to be a funeral atmosphere. The older people were very sad. The youth were very angry. And they were planning to get back. And I remember they they did burn the hotel. They didn't spray it. They did burn the hotel that Sunday morning. And I remember asking them, why would you burn the hotel down with us in it? I didn't think about that. And that really bothered me because we had a lot of that mindlessness. When fire starts, it's stupid. It doesn't make any distinction between blacks or white.
Well,
so that was probably my lowest point.
Now you've touched on this a couple of times, the idea of there's a seemingly different direction that the older generation was going and what the youth wanted. And
but that's generational. I mean, again, as I get older, I'm a little bit more conservative than I was before. You have a greater stake in society if you're older. I mean, the more you have, the more you want to conserve. I mean, that's logical. We used to say that when you're single, when you eat, your family eats. You don't have to worry about anybody else. My parents, obviously, were very, very concerned about me. But again, when you're 19, 18 years old, you don't think about dying. I mean, today they do. Young people are getting killed so frequently today, but that didn't happen very often. I mean, we did some things now I would shudder to even think about doing today. I mean, I just wouldn't do some of the things that we did then, but you don't think about dying.
going back to this place, and when you read about the political climate in which Morial emerged, you almost always read that the black community was fragmented, the black community was fragmented. This is mostly when they talk about the political organizations we referred to before, the COOP and SOUL and everything.
But those are new political organizations.
Right.
The old organizations were OPPVL, CCIVL, and I forgot Irish Rights Organization, the People's Defense League. Those were basically the three organizations. Reverend A.L. Davis was the president of OPPVL.
And what did that stand for?
Orleans Parish Progressive Voters League. And he
Right.
probably had the most influence. I would say when he and his organization endorsed somebody, easily 60% of the people are going to follow them.
Endorsed white candidates at this time.
Right.
Yeah.
In fact, even over black candidates, because they didn't feel black candidates had a chance. The CCIVL was the Crescent City Independent Voters League. They had come out of the OPPVL when I think Davis had endorsed a white candidate over. No, Davis had endorsed because he was very close to Chuck Morrison and arch segregations for some office. And a lot of the blacks broke with Davis, and it's most of the longshoremen who belong to the CCIVL. Chin Kennedy was president of the ILA, was also president of CCIVL. So we basically had three black citywide groups. And but OPPL had the most credibility. These new organizations will spring up in the late 60s and early
Right.
70s,
But
after the black electorate has already been expanded.
Well, in that period, when these political groups were right before Morial's candidacy, when these political groups were growing up, or were popping up everywhere, it always says that the black community was fragmented in the SOUL and COOP and all that. And at that time, in their vision of the place, for the place of the black community in the governance of New Orleans, was the community or just the leadership that was fragmented?
I think it's much more the leadership, because as I mentioned, when Dutch reigned in 1977, the first primary, I remember Dorothy Taylor and I forgot who her candidate was. She may have supported Kiefer. So, and there were a whole bunch of candidates. So the leaders were fragmented. But if I remember, Dutch got something like 60 to 65% of the black vote.
He actually got, do you know those numbers? 78%.
78% in the primary.
Not in the
In the
first
primary? No, in the
No,
primary.
he didn't get 78% in the first primary.
But do you think that
It shocked a lot of people.
that's what I wanted to ask.
It shocked a lot of people. And then there were a lot of blacks who say, well, I didn't vote for him in the first primary because I didn't think he could win.
64, okay. 64.
Now, once they sensed that he could win, he got about 96, I think, I'm
That's
almost
right.
96, 97% of the black vote in the second primary. I remember because I worked in the lower Ninth Ward and the first primary. And there was some of the blacks who had differences with Judge Morial, did not support him. But again, that was an individual choice. And I know in the particular precincts where we worked, we got close to 70%, which was pretty high turnout for him.
Right.
And the runoff, we got close to 98%. And we had a very, very high turnout in the election. Because again, there are a lot of people voting for Dutch as a symbol for our black mayor. He happened to be the first black mayor. But he had established his credibility. He had been president of the NAACP. He had been elected to the state legislature. He had been a judge. So his name was out there. So obviously he had name recognition.
So this political, all the fragmentation of the political groups that we were discussing have been, in the historiography of the period, have really been emphasized, that there were all these different images of what the future could hold. But you're saying the community had a vision of what could happen that was surprising to probably the people in the political group and the people outside?
A lot of the black politicians were kind of caught. They had been in this patron-client relationship with white politicians, and so in return for delivering some votes, they got something. Well, Dutch was going to get the black votes anyway. So he didn't feel that he had to owe them, have to give them anything. Now, he did, in fact, reward people who came with him the first time. But they weren't going to get the same things from Dutch that they were getting from the white politicians. So I think a lot of them kind of instinctively felt that he was going to be very, very stingy in giving support, whereas they could get little jobs or little favors from whites. He wasn't going to do that anymore. But they couldn't stop it. I remember A.M. Trudeau, who had been a law partner of Dutch, he supported DeRosa in the runoff. They had become enemies by that time. And a lot of it, again, was personality clashes.
I have one last question. We'd like to distinguish between the aspirations of the black community as a whole and that of its political leaders. Du Bois calls for a surrender of racial solidarity. Arnold Hirsch has said that Morial's struggle was to transcend racial barriers and make such distinctions meaningless. Was there a sense in the black community, do you think, at this time that this was Morial's alternative to the politics of the other black political groups? Was it this liberal utopian ideal, or was it a more pragmatic
I think
vision?
it's more pragmatic. I think, for example, if the first serious aspirant for the mayor's office had been other than Morial, the results would have been the same, because you had that in all communities. He happened to be first. They were voting for a symbol of the progress of the race, and he understood that. I mean, he used that pretty well, but the fact that he was first, he had been first in any other things, and he was very well known. He was shrewd. I mean, once he got to be mayor, he bypassed a lot of the old black leaders, cultivated some. He was very, very shrewd in cultivating a good relationship with the ministers. He flattered them. And a lot of them weren't looking for jobs, but little favors. I mean, I remember going with him to one of these meetings, and he's talking to them, and one of the ministers got up and said, "Mr. Mayor, we've been having problems in our community with these young boys hanging out at these bars. Something needs to be done. Where's that, Reverend? We're going to take care of that, Reverend. Somebody has had problems getting approval for a permit to expand a parking lot. We'll take care of that." And of course, they're flattered that there is a mayor now that they can go to, that they know and talk to. So in the past, you had to have an intermediary. You had some little black functionary who you went to, and then he was the person who dealt for you. Morial, of course, embodied all of that now. So a lot of that was personality clashes. But Dutch had some of his own personal weaknesses too. He did not cultivate any successor. And there are people who criticize him for that, that he did not really train anybody else to come behind him.
Has anyone come behind him?
Well, Sidney, Mark, and now Ray Nagin. They all are his successors. I mean, you can't rewrite history. They are there because he was there. And the most remarkable thing about Dutch Morial that a lot of people don't talk about, his was scandal-free, and they were looking at him. There was not even a hint of a scandal while he was mayor. I mean, he had some other problems, but that was not one of them. Scrupulously honest.
So he set a good example for that.
And it wasn't necessary to follow it, but
Yes.
he did in fact blaze the trail. But Dutch was basically a civil rights man, because while he was mayor, he was on the NAACP National Board of Directors. And I remember going to a couple of meetings in New York with him, and he shocked me when he mentioned that Benjamin Hooks had asked him to be his assistant. He was considering. I said, "Why would you take that position? Why would you come down?" And I think basically he was kind of looking for something to do. But he was, even when he was mayor, I mean, when at the time he was elected mayor, he was on the executive committee of the NAACP. He resigned, but he maintained very close contact with the leadership of the NAACP, made sure that they were invited everywhere.
So you're distinguishing between the civil rights track and the political track all the way through.
He maintained the ties to civil rights that he had developed before he became a politician.
Well, thank you so much.
Well,
appreciate it very
for
much.
asking me. I just talked about this in my little talk the other night.
Oh, good. And we'll conclude our conversation with Dr. Cassimere. Thanks.
Okay.